First, I would like to change the value of my counter right away in the initState function. So in initState, read the counter value of the counter change notify class, add 10, and store it in my counter. If you do this, it should display 10 in my counter and 0 in counter. But I will check after a hard restart to see if this is actually the case. When I go to counter page, it displays 0 and 10. Next, before modifying the value of the my counter variable, let's call the counter change notifier's increment function. To summarize, when initState is called, the counter value is incremented by 1 and value incremented by 1 plus 10 is stored in my counter. In this way, when you enter the page for the first time, the count should be 1 and my count should be 11. Let's see if this is the case. Let's make a hard restart and go to the counter page. When I went into counter page, counter 1 and my count 11 were displayed, so it seems to have been executed normally. However, an error was displayed in the debug console. It is not convenient to view it in the debug console, so I will look at it on a separate page. It's the famous error message, set state or mark needs build called during build, message that anyone who builds Flutter apps has seen at least once. If you look at the underlined part here, the framework is already in the process of building the widgets, but it is saying that the widget displaying the counter value of the counter change notifier cannot be marked as needing to be built. To reward this, it is saying the framework is currently drawing widgets, so you shouldn't say, "Hey framework, draw this widget too" again. So how do I get counter to display 1 and my counter display 11 without error? Before we do anything, let's take a moment to talk about the rendering process of a stateful widget. The process of rendering the page, also called the process of rendering the frame, first creates a build context, calls initState, the chain dependencies, and finally calls build. This completes the page we are viewing. Once the page is complete, you can make it start drawing something else, but there are a few things to keep in mind here. initState is called during the page rendering process. That means the page is being mounted, so you cannot tell it to draw something to the screen using the context. So if we ask it to redraw something else before the build completes, we run into the infamous error, set state or mark needs build. This kind of error also occurs when you ask it to draw something on the screen and then tell it to move to another screen. A state management solution such as a Flutter Block and Riverpod recognize that these errors frequently occur when handling state and have separate handlers to handle things like show dialog, show snackbar, and navigator.push. Now, the provider must have something that can be used in preparation for the case above, right? Unfortunately, the Flutter framework itself provides a feature to handle such cases. Perhaps some beginners may not have heard of it, but those of you who have made a few Flutter apps may have heard of it at least once. The role of addPostFrameCallback is to execute the registered callback after the current frame is completed, which delays the execution of actions affecting the UI to after the current frame. So we can avoid that infamous set state or mark needs build called during build error message. Remember the rendering process of a stateful widgets earlier? The rendering cycle ends only when build function is called. So to avoid this error, you can just wait for the first rendering process to finish. Increment means changing the counter value, so we want a new build. So the addPostFrameCallback method is useful in this situation. Move the existing code in the initState function into the addPostFrameCallback function. At this time, the argument of addPostFrameCallback will not be used, so replace it with an underscore. Do a hard restart and enter the counter page again. The desired result was obtained, and the counter value was also incremented normally. And the debug console didn't show any errors either. Using this function is the same thing as making a reservation saying run me after completing one frame. However, there is another method that is used often other than this one. The first is to give the future.delayed function a 0-second duration and register a callback. Let's run it after a hard restart. In this case as well, it was executed normally, and no error was displayed in the debug console. The following is the method where you use future's microtask. Let's do a hard restart and run it. In this case as well, it works normally, and no error is displayed on the debug console. Since the test is over, I will comment out the microtask and uncomment the addPostFrameCallback. In the case of future, it is delaying the execution of the callback to after the scheduled task, so as a result, it is executed after the build. Before we finish, we will modify all reads in addPostFrameCallback to watch and test. I did a hard restart and went to counter page, and it seems to be displayed normally, but an error message is displayed in the debug console. We'll look at this error message on a separate page. This is the same error message as when using watch in the button callback in the previous example. It is saying that you are trying to listen to a value outside the widget tree, so you should use the listen false option when calling provider.of. You should be able to use the read extension method instead of provider.of listen false. But if you think about it, it is not logically correct to watch the change of a certain state outside the build. So let's revert watch back to read. Next, let's look at what to do when you want to show a dialog right away when the page opens, or when you want to show a dialog when a specific state is reached without any errors.